When 24-year-old Army Specialist Jake Morrison received the old medical kit at his grandfather's funeral, he almost left it behind in the attorney's office, dismissing it as just another piece of military memorabilia that would gather dust in his small apartment. The weathered green canvas bag looked like it had survived wars and decades of neglect, its straps frayed and its surface marked with stains that could have been anything from mud to medicine. But as Jake held it in his hands that gray November afternoon, feeling its unexpected weight and noticing how his grandmother's eyes filled with tears when she saw it, he realized this wasn't just any medical kit. It was a mystery wrapped in canvas and buckles, and inside it lay a fortune that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with the kind of wealth that changes lives forever. Jake had become an army medic almost by accident, following in his grandfather's footsteps without really understanding why until Sergeant William Morrison passed away at the age of 91. Growing up, Jake had heard fragments of stories about his grandfather's service during the Korean War, brief mentions of cold mountains and wounded soldiers, but William had never been one to elaborate. Like many veterans of his generation, he kept his war experiences locked away in a place where words couldn't reach them. Jake had chosen the medical field in the Army partly because it felt like the right kind of service, saving lives instead of taking them, and partly because he wanted to understand the quiet strength he'd always seen in his grandfather's eyes. The funeral had been a military affair, complete with a flag-draped casket and honor guard that fired a 21-gun salute that echoed across the cemetery. Jake stood in his dress uniform, feeling the weight of grief settle on his shoulders like an invisible rucksack he'd have to carry for the rest of his life. His grandmother, Helen, had held his hand throughout the service, her grip surprisingly strong for a woman of 87. After the burial, when family and friends gathered at the house, Helen had pulled Jake aside and told him that William's attorney needed to speak with him about the will. At the attorney's office the following day, Jake learned that his grandfather had left him very specific items. There was no money. William and Helen had lived modestly on his military pension and her teacher's salary, but there were personal effects that William had insisted go to Jake specifically. The attorney, an elderly man named Mr. Patterson who had known William for over 40 years, handed Jake a list written in his grandfather's shaky handwriting. "Your grandfather was very particular about these items," Mr. Patterson explained, adjusting his glasses. "He said you were the only one who would understand their significance, though he admitted you might not understand immediately. He said you'd figure it out when the time was right." The list included William's Korean War uniform, his Purple Heart and other service medals, a box of letters, and the medical kit. Jake accepted them all, carefully packing the uniform and medals into a storage box, setting aside the letters to read later, but when he picked up the medical kit, something made him pause. It was heavier than it should have been for a bag that appeared to contain only old bandages and medical supplies. The canvas was worn smooth in places from years of handling, and someone, presumably William, had carefully repaired tears with precise stitching that spoke of military discipline and attention to detail. "He carried that kit through the entire war," Mr. Patterson said, watching Jake examine it. "He told me once that it saved more lives than he could count, including his own, though he never explained what he meant by that last part." Jake took the kit home to his small apartment near the Army base where he was stationed. He'd been a medic for 3 years now, had deployed once to a relatively quiet region where the biggest medical challenges had been dehydration and training injuries, and he sometimes felt like he was playing at being a soldier rather than actually being one. His grandfather had served in real combat, had seen things Jake hoped he'd never have to see, and yet Jake couldn't shake the feeling that he was supposed to learn something from William's experience, some lesson that had been waiting his entire life to be taught. That evening, Jake cleared space on his small kitchen table and carefully placed the medical kit in the center. He'd postponed looking through his grandfather's letters, not ready yet to confront the emotions they might stir, but the kit felt different somehow, less personal, more like a puzzle to be solved. He unbuckled the straps and opened it carefully, treating it with the same respect he'd give to any medical equipment. Inside, the kit was organized with the same meticulous precision Jake had been taught in his own medic training. There were compartments for different supplies, each carefully labeled in faded ink. Bandages, though yellowed with age, were still neatly rolled. Small bottles that had once contained medications were empty but clean. Scissors, forceps, and other instruments lay in designated pockets, each tool showing signs of heavy use but also careful maintenance. Someone, William, had clearly cleaned and organized this kit many times, treating it not as a relic but as equipment that might still be needed at any moment. Jake carefully removed each item, laying them out on the table and making mental notes. Most of the supplies were standard for Korean War-era medical kits, things he recognized from his training on military medical history. But as he worked his way deeper into the kit's pockets and compartments, he found things that didn't seem to belong in a standard military medical bag. There was a small leather notebook, its cover worn soft as cloth. There was a bundle of photographs held together with a rubber band that had long since lost its elasticity. There was a wooden cross on a chain, clearly handmade, with initials carved into it, JC 1950. And then, in a hidden pocket sewn into the lining of the kit's main compartment, a pocket Jake almost missed because it was so well concealed, he found a sealed envelope with his name written on it in his grandfather's handwriting. Jake's hands trembled slightly as he opened the envelope, being careful not to tear the aged paper. Inside was a letter dated 3 months before William's passing, when he'd still been relatively healthy and clear-minded. Jake began to read, and his grandfather's voice seemed to echo in the quiet apartment. "Dear Jake, if you're reading this, then I've passed on and you've found what I left for you. I'm sorry for the mystery, but some things need to be discovered rather than simply explained. This medical kit was with me through the entire Korean War, from November 1950 when I landed at Incheon until July 1953 when the armistice was signed. In that time, it became more than just equipment. It became a repository of stories, memories, and lessons that I've carried my entire life. I'm giving it to you because you chose to be a medic like I was, and I believe you need to know what that choice really means before you face situations where it will be tested. The fortune hidden in this kit isn't money, son. It's something far more valuable, the truth about what it means to save lives, the cost of that choice, and the incredible weight and beauty of holding another person's life in your hands. Read the notebook. Look at the photographs. And when you're done, you'll understand why I became the man you knew, quiet about the war, but never quiet about the importance of compassion and service. The items in this kit represent specific moments, specific people, and specific lessons. I've waited until after my death to share them because I wanted you to be ready, and I knew you would be ready when you needed to be. Learn from my experiences, Jake. Learn from my mistakes and my small victories. And most importantly, learn that the greatest fortune any medic can have isn't skill or equipment, but the absolute commitment to see every person, enemy or ally, stranger or friend, as a life worth saving. With all my love and pride, Grandpa William." Jake set down the letter, his eyes burning with tears he didn't try to hold back. He picked up the small leather notebook and opened it carefully. The pages were filled with William's handwriting, much steadier than it had been in his final years, and they were dated entries that formed a journal of his time in Korea. But these weren't typical journal entries about daily activities or personal feelings. Each entry was about a specific person William had treated, a brief story about who they were and what happened to them. December 2, 1950, Private James Chin, sucking chest wound from shrapnel. 19 years old, from San Francisco, wanted to be an architect. Stabilized and evacuated. Letters from him later confirmed he survived, went to college on the GI Bill, designed buildings in California. Died in 1987 from natural causes. His daughter wrote to tell me he'd named his first son after me. January 15, 1951, Lieutenant Thomas Bradford, severe frostbite on both feet from being trapped in a foxhole during a blizzard. 23 years old, married, wife expecting their first child. Almost lost both feet, but we kept them warm enough until evacuation. Saw him again in 1965 at a reunion. He walked with a slight limp, but he walked. His daughter was there, beautiful girl, probably 10 years old. He thanked me for letting him dance at his wedding and walk his daughter down the aisle someday. Page after page, William had documented the soldiers he'd treated. Some entries were longer, with more details about the medical procedures and the challenging conditions. Others were heartbreakingly brief. February 28, 1951, Corporal David Miller, age 20. Too many wounds, worked on him for 30 minutes but couldn't stop the bleeding. He asked me to tell his mother he wasn't afraid. I wrote to her. She wrote back. I still have her letters. Jake read through the entire notebook that night, unable to stop even as midnight passed and moved toward dawn. Each entry was a window into not just the war, but into his grandfather's heart. William had remembered every single soldier he treated, had tracked down many of them after the war, had maintained correspondence with families, and had carried the weight of both his successes and his failures with equal seriousness. But it was the photographs that truly brought the stories to life. Jake spread them out on the table, studying each one carefully. Most were black and white images of young men in various states, some smiling at the camera despite bandages and splints, others looking exhausted and traumatized, a few showing William himself, younger than Jake was now, working on patients in makeshift aid stations or even in foxholes under fire. On the back of each photograph, William had written names and dates, sometimes adding brief notes: saved his leg. He made it home. Became a teacher. Had 4 kids. One photograph in particular caught Jake's attention. It showed a young soldier, probably no more than 18, lying on a stretcher with William kneeling beside him. The soldier was conscious and seemed to be laughing at something William had said, despite obvious injuries to his arm and shoulder. On the back, William had written, Private Johnny Martinez, age 18, gunshot wounds to right arm and shoulder. Kept him talking about his girlfriend back home while I worked. He survived, married that girlfriend, became a high school football coach. Visited me in 1995 with his whole family, wife, 4 kids, 3 grandkids. Said I gave him the chance to have that life. I told him he gave me a reason to become a medic in the first place. The wooden cross had its own story, detailed in the notebook. JC stood for James Connolly, a chaplain who had been close friends with William during the war. Connolly had carved crosses for many soldiers during quiet moments, giving them as tokens of hope and protection. He'd given this one to William after William saved the life of a wounded North Korean soldier that their unit had captured, a decision that had been controversial among some of the other soldiers. Some of the men didn't understand why I worked so hard to save an enemy soldier, William had written in that entry. But Chaplain Connolly did. He gave me this cross and said, "A medic doesn't have enemies, Bill. A medic only has patients." That became my philosophy for the rest of the war and the rest of my life. The North Korean soldier survived, recovered from his wounds, and was eventually repatriated. I hope he lived a good life. I hope he went home to a family. I hope he looked at his children and grandchildren and knew that once, a long time ago, an enemy chose to see him as a human being worth saving. As dawn broke and light began filtering through Jake's apartment windows, he sat surrounded by the contents of his grandfather's medical kit, understanding finally what William had meant about the hidden fortune. This wasn't about money or material value. It was about legacy, about the incredible impact one person could have through dedication to preserving life, and about the philosophy that should guide anyone who chose to be a medic. But there was one more thing in the kit, something Jake had initially overlooked because it was tucked into a small pocket at the very bottom of the bag. It was a modern envelope, not aged like the letter to Jake, and inside was a bank statement and a key. The statement showed a savings account in William's name with Jake listed as the beneficiary, and the balance made Jake's heart skip, $247,000. There was a note attached. "Jake, I know I said the fortune wasn't money, and it isn't, not primarily. But I want you to have this too. I saved my pay during the war, invested carefully over the years, and never touched this account. It's been growing for over 60 years. This money is for you to use to continue your education, perhaps to become a physician's assistant or even a doctor if that's what you want. Or use it to help other veterans, to fund medical research, to do something that honors the lives saved and the lives lost. The choice is yours. But whatever you do, remember that the real fortune is the knowledge that you can make a difference, that every life you save creates ripples that extend far beyond what you can imagine. That account number represents every soldier I treated who lived to go home, have families, build lives. Some of them sent me money over the years, even though I never asked for it, just small amounts with notes saying thank you. I saved it all for you. Use it wisely." Use it with the same commitment to life that I tried to demonstrate through my work. That's the real inheritance. Jake sat back, overwhelmed by the weight of what he'd discovered. His grandfather hadn't just left him a medical kit, he'd left him a roadmap for how to live, a philosophy for how to approach his work as a medic, and the means to expand his impact even further. The notebook full of stories, the photographs of saved lives, the cross that represented seeing humanity in everyone, the money that could fund further education or service. All of it was part of a carefully planned legacy that William had been building for decades. Over the following weeks, Jake carried the medical kit with him everywhere, not to use it, the supplies were too old for that, but as a reminder of what his grandfather had taught him. He began reading the notebook entries to other medics in his unit during downtime, sharing the stories and the lessons. The response was powerful. Hardened combat medics, some who'd seen multiple deployments in harsh conditions, found themselves moved by William's detailed attention to each patient and his philosophy of seeing humanity in everyone. Jake also began a project inspired by his grandfather's meticulous record-keeping. He started his own journal, documenting not just the medical cases he handled but the people behind them, their names, their stories, their dreams for the future. He took photographs when appropriate, always with permission, creating his own archive of the lives he touched in his role as a medic. The money presented a more complex decision. Jake knew his grandfather had left it to him with specific purposes in mind, and he wanted to honor that intention. After much thought and consultation with veterans organizations and medical professionals, Jake established the William Morrison Memorial Scholarship Fund. The fund would provide financial assistance to veterans who wanted to pursue careers in healthcare, whether as nurses, physician assistants, therapists, or doctors. It would also support research into better battlefield medical techniques and equipment. But Jake kept enough of the money to fund his own education. Following his grandfather's suggestion, he applied to a physician assistant program with a focus on emergency and trauma medicine. He was accepted and began planning his transition from active duty to the reserves so he could attend school full-time. His goal was to eventually work in a Veterans Administration hospital, providing care to men and women who had served, continuing the legacy of service that William had started over 70 years ago. The wooden cross became Jake's most treasured possession. He had it mounted on a simple chain and wore it during every shift as a medic, hidden under his uniform. It served as a constant reminder of Chaplain Connolly's words that William had passed down: "A medic doesn't have enemies. A medic only has patience." That philosophy was tested 6 months after Jake inherited the kit, during a deployment to a region experiencing increased conflict. Jake's unit was providing security for a humanitarian mission when they encountered an ambush. Several soldiers were wounded, but so were 2 of the attackers who had been injured when their improvised explosives malfunctioned. As the firefight ended and Jake moved to treat the wounded, he faced a choice that echoed his grandfather's experience. The wounded attackers were young, probably teenagers, and they were terrified. Some members of Jake's unit argued against treating them, suggesting they should focus only on their own wounded. But Jake remembered his grandfather's story about the North Korean soldier, remembered Chaplain Connolly's words, and made a decision that he knew William would have approved of. He treated everyone, starting with the most seriously wounded regardless of which side they'd been on. One of the young attackers, a boy probably no more than 16, had severe wounds to his leg that were bleeding heavily. Jake worked on him with the same intensity and care he'd shown to his fellow soldiers, talking to him gently even though they didn't share a language, trying to keep him calm while he stabilized the injury and prevented him from going into shock. The boy survived and was taken into custody for questioning and eventual processing by the authorities. Months later, back at base, Jake received an unexpected message through official channels. The wounded boy, whose name was Ahmed, had provided valuable information during questioning that helped the military locate a cache of weapons and prevent future attacks. He'd told his interrogators that the American medic who saved his life had treated him with more kindness and care than he'd ever received from the people who recruited him. That experience had made him reconsider his choices and decide to cooperate with authorities. The intelligence he provided potentially saved dozens of lives. Jake included this story in his own journal, writing, "Today I understood what Grandpa meant about ripples extending beyond what we can imagine. I didn't save Ahmed's life thinking about intelligence or future attacks. I saved him because he was a wounded human being who needed help. But that choice created ripples I never anticipated. Grandpa was right. The fortune isn't in the outcomes we can control or predict. It's in making the right choice in the moment and trusting that doing the right thing creates positive ripples. The medical kit remained in Jake's possession, carefully preserved and protected. He began taking it to speaking engagements when he was asked to talk about military medicine and veterans' issues. He would display the contents on a table, the old instruments, the photographs, the notebook, and tell his grandfather's stories, explaining what it meant to be a medic and why seeing the humanity in everyone was so crucial to the profession. At one such event at a high school, a young student approached Jake afterward and asked a question that echoed through Jake's mind for days. Your grandfather saved all those lives, and you're saving lives now. But what about the lives you can't save? How do you deal with that? Jake thought about the entries in William's notebook where his grandfather had written about soldiers he couldn't save, about the weight of those failures and how he'd carried them. Jake pulled out the medical kit and opened it to show the student William's journal, pointing to one entry in particular. My grandfather wrote this after losing a patient he'd worked on for over an hour, Jake explained. He wrote, I couldn't save Private Anderson today, and that failure will stay with me forever. But I did everything I could, used every bit of training and equipment I had, and never gave up until his heart stopped. That's all any medic can do, try with everything we have and never give up while there's still hope. We honor the ones we lose by remembering them and by being better for the next patient who needs us. That's how you deal with it. You remember, you learn, and you keep trying. The student, whose name was Marcus, was so moved by the conversation that he later told Jake it had inspired him to pursue a career in emergency medicine. He became a volunteer with his local fire department's EMS unit while still in high school, the beginning of what would become his own journey in emergency medical services. Jake added Marcus to his own journal, noting how his grandfather's legacy was now extending into a third generation of healers. As Jake's own career progressed, he found himself returning to the medical kit again and again, especially during difficult times. When he struggled in his physician assistant program, overwhelmed by the volume of information he needed to learn, he would read his grandfather's journal entries and remind himself why he was pursuing this path. When he faced difficult cases or made mistakes in his clinical rotations, he would touch the wooden cross under his shirt and remember that a medic's job is to try with everything they have, regardless of the outcome. The scholarship fund that Jake had established in William's name began awarding its first grants within a year of its founding. The recipients were veterans from various eras and conflicts, all united by their desire to serve others through healthcare. Jake made it a point to meet each scholarship recipient personally, to tell them about William and his philosophy, and to give them copies of selected pages from William's journal. He wanted them to understand that they were part of a legacy that stretched back decades and would extend far into the future. One recipient, a Marine Corps veteran named Sarah who had served as a combat medic in Iraq, told Jake that reading William's journal entries had helped her process her own experiences and find meaning in her decision to pursue nursing. Your grandfather understood something that took me years to figure out, she said. Every life we save is a victory against all the darkness in the world. Reading his words helped me see my own service in a new light. 3 years after inheriting the medical kit, Jake completed his physician assistant program and accepted a position at a Veterans Administration hospital, fulfilling the goal he'd set when he first understood the full scope of his grandfather's legacy. On his first day of work, he brought the medical kit with him and placed it in his office, where it sat on a shelf visible to every patient who entered. Patients would often ask about the old kit, and Jake would tell them stories from his grandfather's journal, adapting the details to be appropriate for whatever the patient was dealing with. For veterans struggling with PTSD, he might share William's entries about dealing with traumatic cases and finding ways to carry the weight. For veterans dealing with chronic pain from old injuries, he might tell the story of Lieutenant Bradford and the frostbite, and how sometimes the victory is just in surviving with dignity. For veterans who felt forgotten by society, he would show them the photographs and explain how William had tracked down and remembered every single soldier he'd treated. The medical kit became more than just Jake's inheritance. It became a teaching tool, a source of comfort, and a bridge between generations of service members. It represented the continuity of values across time, the importance of seeing humanity in everyone, and the incredible power of one person's commitment to saving lives. On the 5th anniversary of William's passing, Jake organized a memorial event at the VA hospital where he now worked. He invited all the scholarship recipients, veterans organizations, and anyone who had been touched by William's story. The medical kit was displayed in a case of honor, and Jake had created a presentation that included photographs, journal entries, and stories about the ripples that William's service had created. At the event, Jake met someone who brought the entire story full circle in a way he never could have imagined. An elderly man, probably in his late 80s, approached Jake during the reception and asked if he could look at the medical kit more closely. "I think that kit saved my life," the man said, his eyes filling with tears. "My name is James Chin. I was 19 years old, serving in Korea as a private, when I took shrapnel to the chest. A medic named William Morrison worked on me in a frozen aid station, talking to me the whole time about my dreams of becoming an architect. He told me I was going to survive, going to go home, going to design beautiful buildings. And he was right about all of it." Jake stood frozen, unable to speak for a moment. James Chen was the first entry in his grandfather's journal, the first story he'd read that night when he opened the kit for the first time. "You're the architect from San Francisco," Jake finally managed to say. "You named your son after my grandfather." "I did," James confirmed, gripping Jake's hand with surprising strength. "William Morrison gave me my life back. I went on to design schools, hospitals, libraries, buildings meant to help people, because that's what he taught me life was about, helping others. My son is a teacher, my daughter is a doctor, I have 6 grandchildren and 4 great-grandchildren. Your grandfather didn't just save my life that day, he saved all of them too, because none of them would exist if I died in Korea." The two men embraced, both crying, while the other attendees watched in amazement. Jake realized that this moment was the ultimate proof of what his grandfather had tried to teach him, that every life saved creates ripples that extend beyond imagination, that the fortune of a medic isn't measured in money or recognition but in the lives touched and the futures made possible. James Chen had brought photographs of his family, his children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren, and he laid them out next to William's medical kit. "This is your grandfather's fortune," James said. "All these people, all these lives, they exist because of what he did in those few minutes when he refused to give up on a 19-year-old kid who was terrified and bleeding. I want you to add these photos to his kit. I want you to see the fortune he created." Jake did exactly that, carefully adding James Chen's family photographs to the collection his grandfather had started. He updated William's journal with a new entry, documenting this meeting and the incredible closing of a circle that had been opened over 70 years ago. The medical kit became even more precious, now containing not just the stories of lives saved but evidence of the generations that followed, the ripples that had extended far beyond that frozen aid station in Korea. The story of Jake's inheritance and what he'd found in the medical kit spread through the medical and veteran communities. Other veterans who had been treated by William over the years began reaching out, sharing their own stories and photographs. Jake expanded his grandfather's journal, adding their testimonies and creating a comprehensive archive of William Morrison's legacy. The archive eventually became the foundation for a traveling exhibition about military medicine and the philosophy of seeing humanity in everyone, even enemies. Jake continued his work at the VA hospital, wearing the wooden cross every day, keeping his grandfather's medical kit in his office, and maintaining his own journal of the patients he treated. He found himself often thinking about fortunes and legacies, about what it meant to leave something meaningful behind. The money William had left him had been significant, but it was the smallest part of the inheritance. The real fortune was the philosophy, the stories, the examples of compassion and dedication that informed every decision Jake made as a healthcare provider. Years after inheriting the kit, when Jake had his own family and his children asked him about the old green bag in his office, he would take them through it item by item, telling them stories about their great-grandfather and explaining what it meant to be a healer. He wanted them to understand that the greatest fortunes in life aren't found in bank accounts or material possessions but in the impact we have on others, in the lives we touch, and in the values we pass down through generations. The medical kit that Jake had almost left behind in the attorney's office had become the center of his life's work and mission. It represented everything William had tried to teach, that a medic's fortune is measured in lives saved, that seeing humanity in everyone is the highest calling, and that the ripples we create through acts of compassion and service extend far beyond what we can see or imagine. That was the hidden fortune William had preserved in that old canvas bag, waiting for the right person to discover it and carry it forward into the future, ensuring that the legacy of saving lives and honoring humanity would continue for generations to come.